Hello, my name is Squirrely Squirrelton Poop Deck. I'm part of the S3 code sanitation crew at CDF Labs, and you're listening to Dumpster Talk Podcast, episode 6. No, but really, this episode is about good and evil. Does it exist? What is good? What's your definition of evil? So in my last Dumpster Talk podcast episode, which was kind of episode 4 and 5 mixed together, we kind of went over some different concepts. We were talking about morality, we were talking about karma, we were talking about life lessons, and the concept of good and evil kept coming up. So I thought that would be a really interesting thing to have for episode 6, So I just wanted to preface this by saying that I'm sorry if your beliefs or views on the world differ from mine, and that's okay, because our differences make us stronger. We work as a whole when we have differences, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion, and this is just my opinion and my thought process. So I know these types of subjects can be very touchy, especially if religion's mentioned at all. I'm trying my best to keep religious views out of this conversation, but I'm also not coming at it completely from a scientific perspective either. I'm kind of a mix in between. Maybe you could call it more something like spirituality. So what is this episode about? It's about the concept of good and the concept of evil. Are they even a real thing? And in my opinion, I think it's more complicated than 2 English words, right? Words can convey very complex messages and very complex ideas, but it's very hard to compact something like that, like let's say a story or nuclear physics or, ghosts. You can't really compact the context of all that into one word, obviously. That's why you need the textbooks, that's why you need more words, that's why you need stories, that's why you need the English language, that's why you need different languages. But I mean, in general, if you say somebody is a good person or you say somebody's evil, people pretty much know what you're talking about, right? And that's to go with like any concept really. But the thing that I think is a little different here, which, can kind of be said for the same thing as like with ghosts, right? Is I think those concepts in people's heads actually kind of wildly vary pretty hard. So like for instance with ghosts, which by the way, might be episode 7 or 8, we'll have to see because I would love to talk about ghosts. Let's just think of ghosts, for example, right? Ghosts, to one person can mean just a spirit. To another person, it can mean like a demonic entity having to do with like religion. To someone else, it could just be like a memory or a distant past, like the ghost of your past, stuff like that. So, there's all kinds of different cultures, religions, experiences that have to do with ghosts. And none of them you can really per se are correct or invalid, right? And that's where things get a little dicey with the concept of good and evil and heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff, is it honestly varies from person to person. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, what is this squirrel talking about? Because clearly, there's things that are evil or bad, right? And not to get, too crazy over here when I'm just, on my lunch break talking in a dumpster. You're going to think like an acorn fell on my head or something from a tree. But to this squirrel anyway, I don't see it, I think it all matters on context. Like, for instance, one thing I always hear is killing unaliving XYZ, right? So unaliving isn't bad in all contexts, or at least not to everyone, right? So you can think of a bunch of different examples if you really think about it: vigilantes, war, the train dilemma, on and on and on. Unaliving is not always a bad thing, depending on the situation. And you can kind of say that for any other point, right? So like, maybe somebody has a bad experience with someone, or they've committed wire fraud, or, even Hitler, right? Like things like that. You can always contrive like, oh, well, you know, he wouldn't have done all that if people would have just accepted his art and helped him, you know, get into art school and things like that or whatever. But the thing is,
dude, come on, I'm not even near you.
Why are those things bad, right? It's only bad because it causes suffering and pain on a level so unimaginable and so horrible that you can't find any good traits about it or any situations where there's something good about that, right? So that's kind of how I feel about evil. Is like, I don't think it really exists until you get to something that I like to call pure evil, where there's a few very touchy subjects. I'm not going to name what they are, but I can't really justify or think of any reason why those few pure evil concepts would even be allowed to exist in this world at all, you know? And that's where some of my, trouble with religion comes in as well.
Yes.
And the whole idea of like an all-loving, all-seeing God and all that. The three arguments, right? And that's for a later episode about religion or something. I'm not going to get into that. But that's another argument people make all the time is like, oh, well, the reason that stuff exists is because of humans. But that's not true either. I can think of a few pure evil things that occur because of nature. And for instance, the unaliving of innocent life, right? Whether it's animals or humans or plants or whatever, just like, why? Like, why the unnecessary unaliving of that stuff? Or like, why death at all, right? And so that's what I mean. Like, I think even pure evil honestly kind of has to do with context because, well, you might make the argument, oh, well, things need to decompose, chaos, and entropy, like it's a cycle, things need to die for things to live and stuff like that. And I don't know, I just don't really see it. I don't see why there couldn't be a world where things don't die or things, these horrible, horrible things don't have to happen to people and the world still works. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's still like really a pure evil in my mind. So let's switch real quick to good then. So what makes somebody good? Is it donating? Is it holding the door for somebody? Is it, just being there for someone, being there for your partner, being there for your friends?
Okay.
And again, I think that's all contextual, right? Like some people think just because you donate a lot, that makes you a good person. Or there's some people out there that think just because you are part of a religion or you go to church, you're a godly man, then that makes you a good person. And I really don't think that's true either. I think to be a good person or the concept of good in general is also contextual. So like, I think a person's a good person if there's repeatable actions that they take throughout their life to benefit not only themselves, but others, and they're doing it for the right reasons. I think that's like a long-winded way to explain what a good person is. And is there a pure good? I don't know. I don't really think so. I think the closest thing to pure good is maybe like a puppy or a baby or something like that, where it's like, you could also make the argument though that the only reason they seem like they're pure good is because, they're still developing, right? Like how evil can a puppy be? Like, so pure good, I guess, is kind of something like that, but I also struggle to see how that's not contextual either. Like there's the context right there. They're still developing, Give that puppy a few more years. Who's to say they don't turn into a ravaging killer dog or something like that, right? And, on the grander scope of things, scientists try to explain all this with like, I think they basically chalk it up to like your environmental factors and how you grew up and your genetics and, just the state of the world at the time and things like that. And I think that is an unfortunate truth for some of it, but I don't know. I always feel that life is like, like that, like Eminem's song, like, like 50%, determination, 30% work, and like 10% luck and whatever else and stuff. I'm like totally saying that wrong, but you know the song I'm talking about. But I do think luck plays a role in it, which would be another great episode to talk about luck, but I think I'm going to save that for next year for around March for like kind of a cutesy little St. Patrick's Day themed episode or something. But yeah, I think that some of it's luck, but also, like, even if you're born into a perfect situation, like rich people, right? Do I think it's a coincidence that most rich people are not good people, at least in my opinion? I don't think so. I think when you grow up in that kind of environment and you feel entitled and things like that, you got incredibly lucky, and yet you're still choosing to be evil or a bad person, right? So like, I kind of agree with the scientists. Like, maybe it does have a lot to do with like just your environment and the way you grow up and stuff like that. But then that wouldn't explain why some people who are rich are good people, right? Because if it was just due to your environment and whatnot,
Come here, buddy.
obviously then all rich people would just be spoiled, entitled people that just hoard wealth for themselves. So, maybe some of it has to do with that like hard work and determination and free will and stuff like that. I do think free will, whatever you want to call it, environmental factors, things like that, is basically what good and evil is, and people just, like when you're having a conversation, you don't have time to explain all that like this, like in this entire podcast, right? So you would think people would understand those context clues or like have a good grasp and understanding of like all that stuff we just talked about. But I don't know, man. There's a lot of people out there that don't think like that. And they think like being good is, a certain set of things that you have to do or a certain mark in their book of what a good person is and stuff like that. So anyway, that's my opinion. That's what I think good and evil really is. That's what I think that the difference is, and does it exist? Is there a pure evil, a good, pure bad, a pure good, stuff like that. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time.